The chains bit into Iris's wrists as the guards dragged her through the cobblestone streets, and she could feel every eye in the market square burning into her skin with a mixture of contempt and pity. The morning sun cast long shadows across the crowd of werewolves who had gathered to witness her sentencing, their faces twisted with satisfaction at seeing another human brought low. She kept her chin raised, despite the terror clawing at her insides, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. At 19 years old, she had spent her entire life learning to make herself small and invisible in a world that treated humans as little more than servants and occasional entertainment. But today, there would be no hiding from what was coming. The High Court stood at the center of the capital, its black stone walls carved with ancient runes that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly light. Iris had only seen the building from a distance before. A monument to werewolf. Superiority that humans were forbidden from approaching without express permission. Now she was being hauled up its steps like a common criminal, accused of stealing sacred relics from the Temple of the First Shift. A crime so severe that even speaking of it was considered blasphemous. She wanted to scream that she was innocent, that she had been framed by someone with far more power and far darker intentions. But she had learned long ago that human voices carried no weight in werewolf courts. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with incense and the lingering scent of wolf musk that made Iris's stomach turn. The judges sat in elevated seats carved from ancient oak, their eyes glowing with the amber light that marked them as high-ranking alphas who had lived for centuries. At the center sat Elder Thorn, his silver hair flowing past his shoulders and his expression carved from granite as he looked down at her with undisguised disgust. The evidence against her had been laid out with damning precision. Her scent found near the temple vault, witness testimony from wolves who claimed to have seen her lurking in forbidden corridors, and most condemning of all, a piece of torn fabric from her work dress discovered at the scene of the crime. Iris tried to explain that she had been cleaning the temple that day as part of her assigned duties, that anyone could have planted that evidence, that the witnesses were lying for reasons she couldn't understand. But her words fell on deaf ears, drowned out by the growls of approval from the assembled wolves who had already decided her guilt before she ever entered the room. The truth was that someone wanted her gone, wanted her erased from existence so thoroughly that not even her bones would remain as evidence, and they had chosen the one punishment that guaranteed exactly that outcome. Elder Thorn's voice boomed through the chamber as he pronounced her sentence, each word falling like a hammer blow against her heart. She was to be taken to the edge of the wildlands and cast beyond the barrier that separated civilization from chaos, left to face whatever horrors lurked in that cursed territory where even the strongest alphas feared to tread. It was a death sentence dressed up as justice, a way to eliminate an inconvenient human while maintaining the pretense of lawful order. The wildlands had been corrupted centuries ago during the great magical war that had nearly destroyed the world, transformed into a nightmarish landscape where reality itself bent and twisted, where creatures born of dark magic hunted anything foolish enough to enter their domain. No one had ever survived exile to the wildlands. The few wolves who had been sentenced to that fate over the centuries had their life bonds severed within hours, their pack connections snapping like cut strings to announce their deaths to anyone paying attention. Humans, being even more fragile than werewolves in the eyes of the court, stood absolutely no chance of lasting even that long. Iris would be lucky if the corrupted creatures killed her quickly, rather than dragging out her suffering for their own twisted amusement. The guards pulled her from the courtroom before she could mount any further defense, dragging her through back corridors that smelled of mildew and old blood. She caught glimpses of other prisoners in cells along the way, their eyes hollow with despair as they watched her pass. Some of them were human like her, arrested for minor infractions, or simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Others were wolves who had fallen from grace, their crimes severe enough to strip them of pack protection, but not quite worthy of the ultimate punishment that Iris now faced. They threw her into a holding cell that was barely large enough to lie down in, the stone floor cold and damp beneath her bruised knees. Through the narrow window high above, Iris could see the sky beginning to darken as evening approached, painting the clouds in shades of crimson and gold that reminded her achingly of the sunsets she used to watch from the small garden behind the boarding house where she had grown up. That garden had been her sanctuary, the one place where she felt truly at peace, despite the constant weight of living in a world that considered her existence barely worth acknowledging. She had always had a strange connection to growing things, an instinctive understanding of what plants needed to flourish and how to coax life from even the most stubborn soil. The other human girls at the boarding house thought it was just a knack for gardening, but Iris knew it was something more, something she couldn't quite explain even to herself. When she touched the earth, she could feel it responding to her presence, could sense the network of roots and fungal connections that spread beneath the surface like a vast underground web. Sometimes she swore she could hear whispers in the rustling of leaves, ancient voices, speaking in a language she almost understood, but could never quite grasp. Her mother had possessed the same gift, or so Iris had been told by the elderly woman who ran the boarding house. She had died when Iris was barely 3 years old, her memories reduced to fragmentary impressions of gentle hands and a voice that sang lullabies in words that weren't quite any language Iris had learned since. There were no records of who her father had been, or where her mother had come from, only the notation that she had been found wandering the outskirts of the capital with an infant in her arms, and barely any memory of her own name. The werewolf authorities had deemed her harmless enough to allow into the city, assigning her to work in the textile mills until her body gave out from exhaustion and repetitive strain. Iris had spent her childhood trying to be everything her mother apparently hadn't been: useful, obedient, completely unthreatening to the wolves who held absolute power over every aspect of human existence. She worked hard at whatever jobs were assigned to her, kept her head down when alphas passed by radiating their dominance, and never once gave anyone reason to notice her beyond her basic function as a laborer. It should have been enough to keep her safe, to let her live out a quiet life of servitude that at least had the benefit of being predictable and stable. But someone had noticed her anyway, and that someone had decided she needed to disappear. Iris replayed the events of the past week obsessively, trying to identify the moment when she had inadvertently painted a target on her back. She'd been assigned to the cleaning rotation at the Temple of the First Shift, a prestigious position for a human that came with slightly better rations and the privilege of working in one of the most sacred buildings in the capital. The temple was ancient beyond measure, its foundations laid during the time when werewolves first learned to shift between forms, and it housed relics of such profound power that even speaking their names incorrectly was said to invite catastrophe. On the day of the theft, Iris had been scrubbing the marble floors of the outer sanctum when she heard voices coming from deeper within the temple, from areas that were absolutely forbidden to anyone without explicit permission from the high priests. The voices had been arguing, their tones urgent and angry in a way that made Iris's instincts scream at her to leave immediately. But she had been raised to be thorough in her work, and leaving her assigned area without completing her tasks would have resulted in punishment. She had continued cleaning, trying to ignore the voices, even as they grew louder and more heated. Then there had been a sound like shattering crystal, followed by a wave of energy that had rolled through the temple with enough force to knock Iris to her knees. The sensation had been overwhelming, like being submerged in ice water and fire. Simultaneously, and for just a moment she had felt something vast and ancient turn its attention toward her with terrible focus. When she had finally managed to stand again, her legs shaking and her vision swimming, the voices had gone silent, and the temple had returned to its usual state of hushed reverence. Iris had reported the incident to the head of the cleaning staff, a middle-aged human woman named Martha, who had worked at the temple for over 20 years. Martha had gone pale at the description, her hands trembling as she gripped Iris's shoulders and told her in no uncertain terms to forget what she had heard and felt, to never speak of it again to anyone, but it had been too late by then. Within hours, temple guards had arrived to arrest Iris, and the machinery of werewolf justice had ground into motion with inexorable force. Now, sitting in her cell and awaiting transport to certain death, Iris understood with bitter clarity that she had witnessed something she was never meant to see, that the theft had either been committed by someone with enough power to deflect blame onto a convenient human scapegoat, or had been staged entirely as cover for something far worse. The energy she had felt that day still lingered in her bones like the ghost of a scream, and part of her wondered if that ancient presence she had sensed had marked her in some way that even she couldn't perceive. The guards came for her at dawn, their faces carefully blank as they loaded her into a reinforced wagon designed for transporting dangerous criminals. She wasn't given food or water for the 3-day journey to the border, and by the time they finally stopped at the edge of the wildlands, Iris was dizzy with dehydration and weak from hunger. The guards unloaded her without ceremony, cutting the chains from her wrists, but leaving her hands bound in front of her with rough hemp rope that bit into her skin. Before them stretched a landscape that looked like it had been torn from a nightmare and given physical form. The wildlands began with a stark line of demarcation, where healthy forest simply ended and twisted corruption began, as though someone had drawn a boundary in the earth itself and commanded nature to warp beyond it. Trees grew in impossible spirals, their bark blackened and weeping with sap that glowed faintly purple in the dim light. The ground was covered in a carpet of fungi that pulsed with bioluminescence, casting everything in an eerie, shifting glow that made it difficult to judge distances or identify shapes in the shadows. The air itself felt wrong, thick and heavy with an ozone smell that reminded Iris of lightning strikes, and she could hear sounds echoing from deeper in the wildlands that bore no resemblance to any animal she had ever encountered. Howls that rose and fell in patterns that hurt to listen to, skittering sounds that suggested something with far too many legs moving through the undergrowth, and beneath it all, a low humming that seemed to resonate in her bones and make her teeth ache. The head guard, a grizzled alpha with scars covering half his face, grabbed Iris by the shoulder and shoved her toward the boundary line. His voice was rough with what might have been actual regret as he spoke, telling her that if by some miracle she did survive, she was forbidden from ever returning to werewolf territory on pain of immediate execution. Then he cut the ropes binding her hands, turned on his heel, and climbed back into the wagon without looking back. Within minutes, the sound of hoofbeats had faded into the distance, leaving Iris completely alone at the edge of damnation. For a long moment, she simply stood there, staring into the corrupted forest and feeling the weight of her situation pressing down on her like a physical thing. Every survival instinct she possessed screamed at her to run, to flee back toward civilization and beg for mercy, even though she knew none would be forthcoming. But there was nowhere to run, except forward, into the nightmare landscape that had been used as an execution ground for centuries, precisely because nothing survived its touch. Iris took a deep breath, trying to calm the panic threatening to overwhelm her completely, and forced herself to think rationally about her situation. She had no food, no water, no weapons, and no shelter. The clothes she wore were the simple work dress she had been arrested in, already torn and filthy from days of rough treatment. Night would fall in a few hours, and she had no illusions about her chances of surviving in the dark, when she could barely see the dangers that lurked in broad daylight. But as she stood there on the threshold between the world she knew and the one that promised only death, Iris felt something shift inside her chest, a sensation like a door opening in a room she hadn't known existed. The wrongness of the wildlands that made every other part of her recoil in horror was calling to something deep in her blood, something that recognized the corruption not as an enemy, but as a sickness that needed healing. The whispers she had heard all her life in the rustling of leaves suddenly grew louder, resolving into something almost like words, and she understood with startling clarity that her strange connection to nature hadn't been just a quirk or a minor talent. It had been preparation for this exact moment. She had been shaped by forces she didn't understand, to be able to walk in places where others could not, to bridge the gap between health and corruption, to find life even in the heart of death. Iris didn't know if that meant she would survive, didn't know if her newfound understanding was real, or simply her mind's desperate attempt to find hope in a hopeless situation. But she knew that standing frozen at the boundary would accomplish nothing except delaying the inevitable. So she stepped forward, crossing the line into the wildlands, and felt reality shift around her, like a cloak settling onto her shoulders. The purple glow of the fungi seemed to brighten in her presence, and the humming in her bones transformed from painful to almost harmonious, as though the land itself was adjusting its frequency to match hers. Iris walked deeper into the twisted forest, her bare feet somehow finding purchase on ground that looked treacherous, her path lit by bioluminescent plants that seemed to lean toward her as she passed. Behind her, the world of werewolf supremacy and human subjugation continued on without pause, unaware that they had just sent the one person capable of reclaiming the wildlands into its very heart. And far to the north, in his fortress of black stone and ancient power, Alpha Kale felt the faintest tremor run through the magical wards that monitored the boundary, a disturbance so subtle that he almost dismissed it as meaningless. Almost, but not quite, because something in his blood recognized that the balance of power in his world had just shifted in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The human girl who was supposed to die screaming in the dark had instead taken her first steps toward becoming something that would shake the very foundations of everything he had built his life upon. And neither of them would ever be the same once their paths finally crossed. If you're enjoying this story, please leave a like and let me know in the comments what you think will happen when Iris and Kale finally meet. And don't forget to subscribe for more supernatural, romance stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. The first night in the wildlands taught Iris that survival was going to require completely abandoning everything she thought she knew about how the world worked. As darkness fell, the forest transformed into something even more alien and threatening, with shadows that moved independently of any light source and sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She had found a small clearing where the corruption seemed slightly less intense. The trees merely twisted rather than actively malevolent in appearance, and she had curled up against a large boulder that still retained some warmth from the day's sun. Sleep was impossible, not just because of the very real danger surrounding her, but because the moment she closed her eyes, Iris became intensely aware of the network of life struggling to persist beneath the corruption. It was like suddenly gaining a new sense, one that allowed her to perceive the underground rivers of energy that connected every living thing, the fungal networks that carried information and nutrients between trees, the bacterial colonies that broke down dead matter and returned it to the cycle of growth. In a healthy forest, that network would have been vibrant and balanced, a beautiful complexity that sustained itself through countless tiny interactions. Here in the wildlands, that network was diseased and dying, choked by the magical corruption that had seeped into the eye. Soil like poison, but it wasn't dead, not completely, and Iris could feel it reaching toward her presence like a drowning person grasping for a lifeline. Without consciously deciding to do so, she pressed her palms flat against the earth and let herself sink into that underground awareness, following the threads of connection to identify where the corruption was strongest and where patches of relative health still clung to existence. What she found shocked her into full alertness. The corruption wasn't a natural phenomenon at all, but rather the lingering remnant of an enormous magical working that had been performed centuries ago, a spell so powerful and so poorly controlled that it had scarred the land itself. Worse, she could sense that the spell had been designed specifically to sever the connection between the earth and something else, something that should have been present, but was now conspicuously absent. It felt like looking at a painting where an entire figure had been carefully painted over, leaving a person-shaped hole in the composition that the eye couldn't help but notice. Iris pulled her hands back from the earth, her heart racing as understanding began to dawn. The wildlands weren't corrupted because of some ancient war or natural disaster. They had been deliberately damaged, transformed into a wasteland as part of a magical working meant to cut off access to something that someone had desperately wanted to destroy or hide. And that something was connected to whatever presence she carried in her blood, whatever heritage her mother had passed down to her, along with her green eyes and her instinctive understanding of growing things. Before she could process that revelation further, Iris heard movement in the underbrush surrounding her clearing, the sound of something large and predatory circling her position with terrifying patience. Her muscles locked with fear as she tried to identify the threat, but the darkness was too complete and the shadows too mobile for her merely human senses to penetrate. Then a creature stepped into the faint bioluminescent glow cast by the fungi, and Iris had to bite down on her lip to keep from screaming at the sight of it. It looked like a wolf, but twisted and enlarged until it stood nearly as tall as a horse at the shoulder, its fur matted and falling out in patches to reveal skin that was covered in tumorous growths that pulsed with that same sickly purple light. Its eyes were milky white and obviously blind, but it tracked her position with perfect accuracy, suggesting it was using some other sense to hunt. When it opened its mouth, Iris saw that it had far too many teeth arranged in concentric circles like a lamprey, and its breath smelled of rot and corruption so intense it made her gag. The corrupted wolf thing took a step toward her, then another, its massive paws leaving prints in the earth that smoked faintly with residual dark magic. Iris knew she should run, should try to find shelter or a weapon or anything that might give her even the slightest chance of survival. But instead, she found herself standing up and holding her ground, that strange new awareness in her chest flaring to life with an intensity that left her breathless. She could feel the creature's pain radiating from it in waves, could sense that underneath the corruption and the magical damage, this had once been a normal wolf that had simply been in the wrong place when the ancient spell was cast. Acting on pure instinct, Iris held out her hand toward the creature and let that awareness in her chest flow down her arm and out through her palm, manifesting as a soft green light that was nothing like the harsh purple of corruption. The light touched the wolf thing's snout, and it froze in place, its body going rigid as though it had been turned to stone. For a heartbeat, nothing happened, and Iris thought she had made a terrible mistake that would cost her life. Then the creature began to shake, its whole body convulsing as the green light spread across its form like water soaking into dry earth. The tumorous growths began to shrink and dissolve. The matted fur fell away to reveal new healthy growth underneath, and the milky eyes cleared to show the warm amber gaze of a natural wolf. The transformation took less than a minute, but by the time it was complete, Iris was on her knees and gasping for breath, feeling as though she had just run for miles without stopping. The healed wolf stood before her, no longer the size of a horse but merely large, and it regarded her with an expression that held far more intelligence than any normal animal should possess. Then it did something that made Iris's blood run cold with implications she was only beginning to understand. The wolf bowed its head to her, lowering itself into a posture of complete submission and respect that she had only ever seen werewolves offer to their most powerful alphas. It held that position for several seconds before turning and disappearing back into the forest, leaving Iris alone once more, but fundamentally changed by what had just occurred. She had healed corruption that was supposed to be permanent and irreversible. She had taken something that every werewolf in the capital believed was beyond any hope of redemption, and restored it to wholeness, with nothing but her own will and whatever strange power flowed through her blood. That shouldn't have been possible. And yet she had just done it, as naturally as breathing, as though her whole life had been building toward exactly this moment and this purpose. Iris spent the rest of the night alternating between exhausted sleep and startled wakefulness, her dreams filled with images of vast forests and ancient stone circles, of people who looked like her mother speaking in that almost language she couldn't quite grasp. When dawn finally broke, painting the twisted canopy in shades of sickly yellow and green, she forced herself to stand. Despite every muscle in her body screaming in protest, she needed to find water and food, needed to establish some kind of sustainable situation if she was going to survive long enough to understand what she had become and why. The healed wolf returned as she was examining the edible-looking fungi growing on a fallen log, and this time it wasn't alone. 3 more corrupted wolves followed in its wake, their bodies showing varying degrees of magical damage, but all of them regarding Iris with those milky blind eyes that somehow tracked her every movement. She understood immediately what they wanted, could feel their desperate hope radiating from them like heat from a fire, and she knew she couldn't refuse, even though the healing the previous night had left her feeling hollowed out and fragile. One by one, she touched each corrupted wolf and let that green light flow through her palms, watching as the corruption dissolved and healthy nature reasserted itself. By the time she finished, with the 3rd wolf, Iris was so exhausted she could barely stand, and she had to lean against a tree to keep from collapsing entirely. but the 4 healed wolves surrounded her in a protective circle, their warm bodies providing shelter and their presence keeping other predators at bay. And for the first time since being thrown into the wildlands, Iris felt something other than terror. She felt purpose, and the beginning of something that might eventually become hope. The days began to blur. Together, as Iris settled into a routine of survival that would have seemed impossible just a week before, the healed wolves stayed with her, hunting for food and leading her to sources of fresh water that bubbled up from underground springs still pure enough to drink. She discovered that many of the twisted plants in the wildlands were actually edible once she used her strange abilities to purify them, and that the corruption responded to her touch like an infection to medicine, retreating and dissolving when confronted with her presence. Word of her existence spread through the wildlands in ways that defied normal explanation, carried by the network of life she could sense beneath the earth and through the behaviors of the creatures she healed. More animals came to her each day, some so badly corrupted they were barely recognizable as the species they had once been, others showing only minor damage that could be repaired with a simple touch. Birds with feathers that grew in impossible spirals, deer whose antlers had fused into crown like structures that trapped them in permanent pain, even insects whose bodies had been twisted into forms that prevented them from fulfilling their ecological roles. Iris healed them all, and with each healing, she felt herself growing stronger rather than weaker, as though the act of purifying corruption was feeding something inside her that had been starved for her entire life. She began to understand that she wasn't drawing on her own energy to perform these healings, but rather channeling something far older and more vast, tapping into a source of power that existed in the bones of the world itself. The guardians, the voice in her dreams whispered. Those who walked between civilized and wild, who maintained the balance and ensured that neither magic nor nature overwhelmed the other. Her mother had been one of them, she realized, and so had her grandmother, and every woman in her maternal line, stretching back thousands of years to a time before werewolves learned to shift, before humans built cities and claimed dominion over the earth. They had been the keepers of harmony, the healers of corruption, the voices that spoke for the voiceless parts of creation. And when the werewolves had risen to power, when they had claimed magic for themselves and built their civilization on the subjugation of both humans and nature, the guardians had been systematically hunted down and eliminated as threats to the new order. The Sedgina spell that created the wildlands had been the final blow in that genocidal campaign, Iris understood now. It had been designed to sever the connection between the guardians and the source of their power, to poison the wild places so thoroughly that no one with guardian blood could survive in them. But the spellcasters had made one critical error in their calculations. They had assumed that corruption was the opposite of life, that by filling the wildlands with dark magic, they would create a zone of death that would destroy anyone who entered. What they had actually created was a wound, and wounds could be healed by someone with the right knowledge and the will to endure the pain of treatment. Every day that Iris spent in the wildlands, every creature she purified and every plant she restored, was like applying medicine to that ancient wound. She could feel the land responding to her presence, could sense the corruption retreating inch by inch as the natural balance began to reassert itself. It was slow work that would likely take years or even decades to complete fully, but it was working, and that was what mattered. 3 months after being thrown into the wildlands to die, Iris had transformed a significant area around her initial entry point into something approaching a normal forest, a growing bubble of health and vitality in the heart of corruption. The healed animals that stayed with her had formed something like a pack, with the first wolf she had saved acting as their leader and coordinator. They brought her offerings of food and useful materials, helped her construct a shelter from fallen branches and living vines that she coaxed into growing in specific patterns, and kept watch while she slept so that no corrupted creature could attack her unaware. She had even begun to experiment with speaking to the plants directly, using that almost language she heard in her dreams to encourage specific types of growth or to ask certain species to produce medicine she needed. To her amazement, they responded, not with words but with actions, growing berries out of season, or developing compounds in their leaves that could treat infection or reduce pain. The relationship was collaborative rather than commanding, a partnership between herself and the green-growing world that felt more natural and right than anything she had experienced in her old life of servitude. And through it all, Iris felt herself changing in ways that went beyond just her. Expanding abilities. She was no longer the frightened girl who had been dragged through the capital in chains, no longer willing to make herself small and invisible to avoid drawing dangerous attention. She walked through her healing forest, with her head held high and her eyes bright with purpose, and when she looked at her reflection in the clear streams that now flowed through the area, she saw someone who looked almost ethereal, as though she was becoming more spirit than flesh with each passing day. Her hair, always a simple brown before, now held streaks of green that seemed to shift in the light, and her eyes had developed a faint glow that reminded her of the bioluminescent fungi that had guided her first night. Her skin had taken on a quality that was hard to describe, still clearly human, but somehow more vital, as though she was vibrating at a slightly different frequency than normal people. The changes should have frightened her, but instead they felt like finally becoming what she was always meant to be, like shedding a disguise she had worn for so long, she had forgotten it wasn't her true face. The werewolf realm remained blissfully unaware of what was happening in the wildlands, convinced that Iris had died within hours of being exiled just like every other poor soul sentenced to that fate. The barrier wards that monitored the boundary for any attempt to return showed no signs of being tested, and the magical corruption that had always radiated from the wildlands remained strong enough at the edges to discourage any investigation. As far as the High Court was concerned, justice had been served and the matter was closed. Just another human removed from existence for crimes against the natural order of werewolf superiority. But in his fortress far to the north, Alpha Kale found himself unable to shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in his world, something that niggled at his awareness like a splinter he couldn't quite locate to remove. He was ancient by werewolf standards, over 500 years old, and powerful enough that even other alphas treated him with cautious respect, bordering on fear. He had built his territory through a combination of strategic brilliance and ruthless efficiency, crushing any challenge to his authority before it could fully form and establishing a reputation that made most potential enemies reconsider before ever raising a hand against him. His power came from his connection to the deep magic that all werewolves drew upon for their shifting abilities. But Kale's connection was stronger and more refined than most, allowing him to sense disturbances in the magical currents that flowed through the earth. For the past 3 months, those currents had been changing in subtle but undeniable ways, becoming clearer and stronger in the regions around the wildlands, as though something was purifying them at the source. It should have been impossible, and yet Kale's senses didn't lie, which meant something in the wildlands was actively working against the corruption that had been established there centuries ago. He had sent scouts to investigate, of course, but they had all returned with the same report. The boundary of the wildlands remained as impassable as ever, the corruption still thick enough at the edges to turn back anyone foolish enough to try to enter. Whatever was happening was taking place deep inside the cursed territory, far beyond where any werewolf could safely travel. Kyle had considered mounting a larger expedition with powerful alphas who might be able to push further into the wildlands. But something held him back, some instinct that warned him the time wasn't right for direct confrontation with whatever force was at work. Instead, he had increased monitoring of the boundary and ordered his intelligence network to search the archives for any historical accounts of the wildlands behaving abnormally. What they had discovered had troubled him, more than he wanted to admit. There were references, carefully buried in documents that had been classified and restricted for centuries, to people called guardians who had once lived in harmony with the wild places, and who possessed abilities that made them dangerous to the emerging werewolf civilization. The last guardian had supposedly been killed nearly 800 years ago, their bloodline extinguished to prevent any future challenge to werewolf dominance. But bloodlines had a way of persisting even when they should have died out completely, and Kyle couldn't shake the suspicion that somehow, impossibly, a guardian had survived and was now active in the wildlands. The timing couldn't be coincidental. 3 months ago, a human girl had been exiled to the wildlands for theft of sacred relics. And 3 months ago, the magical currents had begun to change. Kyle had pulled the court records and read them with growing interest, noting the inconsistencies in the evidence and the suspicious haste with which the sentence had been carried out. Someone had wanted that girl gone quickly and permanently, which suggested she was more important than a simple human servant should have been. Kyle made note of her name, Iris, and her physical description, storing the information away for future reference. If she had somehow survived, and if she was indeed a guardian, then she represented both a threat and an opportunity of enormous magnitude. A threat, because guardian abilities could potentially unravel the magical foundations that werewolf civilization was built upon, and an opportunity because controlling such power could elevate whoever possessed her to unprecedented levels of influence. The rational part of Kale's mind told him to organize an immediate expedition to hunt down and eliminate this potential guardian before she could grow strong enough to pose a real danger. But there was another part of him, older and more primal, that was intensely curious about what kind of person could survive in the wildlands and begin to heal corruption that had resisted every other attempt at purification. That part of him wanted to see this Iris for himself, wanted to understand what made her different, and whether she truly posed a threat, or might instead be something else entirely. 6 months after Iris's exile, Kale made his decision. He would go to the wildlands himself, alone, and he would find this mysterious guardian who should not exist. It was a risk, certainly, but he had survived 5 centuries by knowing when to be cautious and when to be bold, and his instincts were screaming at him that this was a moment that required boldness. He left his fortress without informing anyone of his true destination, citing a need to inspect border territories and evaluate defensive preparations, and he headed south toward the wildlands, with a sense of anticipation he hadn't felt in decades. The journey took 2 weeks of hard travel, and with each mile, closer to his destination, Kale felt the change in the magical currents growing more pronounced. By the time he reached the boundary, the difference was undeniable. The corruption that should have been overwhelming even from a distance was noticeably diminished, still present, but no longer the choking miasma that had characterized the wildlands for centuries. He could see the physical changes as well, patches of healthy green showing through the twisted purple and black of corrupted forest, and he could hear bird calls that had no business existing in a place of death. Kale shifted into his wolf form, a massive black creature that stood taller than a normal wolf, with eyes that glowed silver with contained power, and he crossed the boundary into the wildlands with his senses pushed to their absolute limit. The corruption tried to latch onto him immediately, seeking to drain his life force and twist his body into something malformed, but his strength was more than sufficient to resist its influence. He pushed deeper into the cursed territory, following the currents of purified magic toward their source, and as he traveled, he saw more signs of impossible healing. Trees that had been dead for centuries were sprouting new growth. Streams that had run foul with corruption now flowed clear and clean. And everywhere he looked, life was reasserting itself with vigor that defied explanation. The corrupted creatures that should have attacked him on sight instead fled from his presence, and Kale gradually realized they weren't fleeing from him, but rather running toward something, seeking the source of healing that had already saved so many of their fellows. He found her in a clearing at the heart of the largest patch of healed forest, and the sight of her made him stop in his tracks with something very close to awe. Iris sat in the center of a circle of animals that ranged from tiny birds to a bear that must have weighed over 1,000 pounds. Her hands pressed against the earth, and her eyes closed in concentration as green light pulsed from her body in waves. She was healing the land itself, Kyle realized, pouring her energy directly into the soil to accelerate the purification process, and the amount of power flowing through her was staggering. She was also nothing like what he had expected. The court records had described a plain human girl, with brown hair and unremarkable features. Someone who wouldn't stand out in a crowd of servants. The woman before him was radiant, almost painful to look at directly. Her hair shot through with living green, and her skin glowing with an inner light that spoke of deep connection to primal forces. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with mere physical appearance, and everything to do with the sheer presence she radiated, the sense that she was more real and vital than anything else in the clearing. Kale shifted back to human form, his clothes materializing around him through the magic that all-powerful alphas commanded, and he took a step into the clearing. Every animal in the circle immediately turned to face him, their eyes glowing with protective fury. And he felt the atmosphere change as Iris opened her eyes and fixed him with a stare that seemed to see straight through all his defenses and armor. Her eyes were green, not the normal green of human irises, but a deep emerald shot through with veins of gold that swirled like living fire. When she spoke, her voice held harmonics that made his bones resonate in sympathy, as though she was speaking not just with her voice but with the voice of the forest itself. She asked him who he was and what he wanted, and Cale found himself answering with more honesty than he had intended, telling her his name and admitting that he had come to see if the rumors of a guardian surviving in the wildlands were true. Iris studied him for a long moment, and Cale had the uncomfortable sensation of being judged and found wanting, measured, against some standard he didn't understand, and coming up short. Then she smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through storm clouds, transforming her face from merely beautiful to absolutely devastating. She told him that she was indeed a guardian, probably the last of her kind, and that she had no intention of leaving the wildlands until her work of healing was complete. She also told him, with perfect calm, that she knew he had come to assess whether she posed a threat to werewolf civilization, and that his decision about what to do with that information would determine whether they became enemies or something else. The clearing fell silent as Cale processed her words, aware that every creature present was poised to attack if he made a wrong move. He could kill Iris easily, probably, his strength and speed far exceeding what any human could match, even one touched by guardian magic. But doing so felt wrong in a way that transcended mere tactics or strategic thinking, felt like it would be destroying something precious and irreplaceable for the sake of maintaining a status quo that perhaps didn't deserve to be maintained. Instead of attacking, Cale did something he hadn't done in centuries. He lowered himself to one knee in a gesture of respect, if not quite submission, acknowledging that Iris's power and purpose were worthy of recognition, even if they conflicted with everything his civilization stood for. He told her that he had come expecting to find a threat, but what he had found instead was something he didn't have words to describe, and that he needed time to understand what her existence meant for the future of werewolves and humans alike. Iris regarded him with those swirling green and gold eyes, and Cale felt something shift between them, a connection forming that was neither mate bond nor pack bond, but something entirely other, something that felt like recognition across a vast distance. She told him he could stay in her forest if he wished, could observe and learn, and come to his own conclusions about whether healing corruption was truly a threat, or simply the restoration of balance that should never have been destroyed in the first place. That night, as Cale sat across a small fire from Iris and listened to her explain the history of the Guardians and the terrible mistake that had created the wildlands, he felt his entire worldview beginning to crack like ice under spring sun. Everything he had believed about the natural order, about werewolf superiority and human inferiority, about the necessity of dominance and the weakness of compassion, was being challenged by the simple existence of this woman who had survived what should have killed her and transformed death into life through sheer force of will and purpose. He found himself telling her things he had never spoken aloud, about the loneliness of power and the weight of maintaining control through fear, about the nagging suspicion that the civilization he had spent centuries defending was built on foundations of injustice that corrupted everyone who benefited from them. Iris listened without judgment, her presence somehow making it safe to voice doubts and fears that would have been seen as catastrophic weakness if spoken to any other werewolf. When dawn broke over the healing forest, painting everything in shades of gold and green that reminded Cale of Iris's eyes, he knew he had reached a decision point. He could return to his fortress and his territory, could mobilize his forces to destroy the wildlands and the Guardian who threatened the status quo, could continue on the path he had walked for 500 years, or he could stay, could learn from Iris and help her complete her work of healing, could use his power and influence to begin dismantling the systems of oppression that had seemed so necessary before, but now felt like chains around his soul. The rational choice was obvious. Going back to his territory was the safe option, the one that preserved his position and his power. But Cale had not survived 5 centuries by always taking the safe path, and something in his blood recognized that Iris represented a chance for transformation that might never come again. So he stayed, and in staying, he set in motion events that would eventually shake the werewolf world to its foundations and force everyone to confront the lies they had been telling themselves about superiority and worthiness and the right to dominance. Thank you so much for watching, and if you want to see how this incredible love story continues and what happens when the werewolf world discovers that Cale has allied himself with a guardian, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. The weeks that followed Cale's decision to remain in the healing forest were a revelation for both of them, though neither would have phrased it quite that way. Iris had never interacted extensively with a werewolf before, certainly never with an alpha of Cale's power and status, and she discovered that her assumptions about their kind were as flawed and incomplete as their assumptions about humans had been. Cale was arrogant and used to absolute obedience, certainly, but he was also wickedly intelligent and possessed a dry sense of humor that caught Iris off guard when he deployed it, and there was a capacity for introspection in him that she suspected most werewolves never developed. He threw himself into understanding guardian magic with the same intensity he had apparently brought to every other pursuit in his long life, asking questions that ranged from basic to profoundly complex, and insisting on trying the techniques himself, even when Iris warned him that werewolf magic and guardian abilities drew from fundamentally different sources. The results were mixed at best, with Cale managing to purify small patches of corrupted soil through sheer brute force application of power, but unable to achieve the elegant efficiency that came naturally to Iris. Watching him struggle with something that felt effortless to her gave Iris a new appreciation for how different their respective gifts truly were. Werewolf magic was about dominance and transformation, about imposing will upon reality, and forcing it to conform to the caster's desires. Guardian abilities were collaborative, about listening to what the world needed and facilitating those needs rather than commanding obedience. Neither approach was inherently superior, but they were designed for entirely different purposes, and trying to make one function like the other was like trying to use a hammer to paint a portrait. Cale, for his part, found himself fascinated by Iris in ways that went far beyond simple physical attraction, though that was certainly present as well. She moved through her forest with unconscious grace, her every gesture somehow perfectly aligned with the rhythms of life around her, and she approached problems with a patience and careful observation that was the polar opposite of his own preference for direct action and decisive resolution. When she worked, healing corruption, or coaxing new growth from damaged plants, there was an expression of complete absorption on her face that Cale found mesmerizing, as though nothing else in the world existed except her and the life she was nurturing back to health. They talked for hours each evening, trading stories of their vastly different lives and experiences. Iris told him about growing up in the boarding house, about her mother's mysterious death, and her own desperate attempts to be invisible enough to survive in a world that offered humans no real protection or value. Cale shared memories of his own transformation into a werewolf over 5 centuries ago, when the gift had been rare and coveted rather than the hereditary trait it had become, and about the wars and political machinations that had shaped the current world order. It was during one of these conversations that Iris finally asked the question that had been bothering her since Cale's arrival. She wanted to know why werewolves had chosen to build their civilization on the subjugation of humans and the suppression of guardian abilities. What threat they had perceived that required such extreme measures. Kyle was quiet for a long time before answering, his expression troubled as he struggled to articulate ideas he had never questioned before. He told her that in the early days of werewolf emergence, when the gift of shifting first appeared, those who possessed it had been hunted and killed by both humans and guardians, who saw them as abominations against natural order. The werewolves had been few in number and vulnerable, forced to hide their nature or face execution, and that experience had created a deep paranoia about anything that could challenge their right to exist, When they finally grew strong enough to fight back, they had done so with overwhelming force, determined to ensure they would never again be at the mercy of others' judgment. But somewhere along the way, Cale admitted, defense had transformed into conquest, and ensuring survival had become justification for dominance. The werewolves had convinced themselves that they were superior to humans and guardians, that their ability to shift made them naturally suited to rule, and they had built an entire civilization around that fundamental lie. By the time Cale had risen to power, subjugation of humans was so normalized that questioning it was considered a sign of weakness or madness, and the guardians were barely remembered except as bogeymen used to frighten children. Iris listened to this explanation with a complex mix of emotions swirling in her chest. She understood the fear that had motivated the early werewolves, could even sympathize with their desire to protect themselves from persecution, but she also saw clearly how that fear had been allowed to metastasize into cruelty, how the victims of one injustice had become the perpetrators of an even greater one, and how that cycle would continue endlessly unless someone was brave enough to break it. She asked Cale if he thought werewolf civilization could be reformed, if there was any possibility of creating a world where humans, guardians, and werewolves coexisted as equals, rather than in a hierarchy of dominance and submission. His answer was brutally honest. He didn't know, but he suspected that attempting such reform would require dismantling so many entrenched power structures and challenging so many comfortable assumptions that it might well trigger a civil war among werewolves that would make the original conflicts look tame by comparison. But he also said, with a fierce intensity that made Iris's breath catch, that the current system was unsustainable and unjust, and that meeting her had forced him to confront truths he had been avoiding for centuries. If there was even a chance of creating something better, something that didn't require the systematic oppression of entire populations to function, then he was willing to risk everything he had built to pursue that chance. His eyes met hers across the fire, and Iris saw in them a combination of determination and vulnerability that made her heart ache with feelings she wasn't ready to examine too closely. The moment stretched between them, heavy with implications and unspoken possibilities, until one of Iris's healed wolves interrupted by dropping a rabbit carcass at her feet with an expression of proud accomplishment. The absurdity of the timing made them both laugh, breaking the tension, and they fell into easier conversation about practical matters, like how best to expand the healing zone, and whether Cale's scouts would eventually notice his prolonged absence. As it turned out, Cale's absence had indeed been noted, and the response was more dramatic than either of them had anticipated. 2 months after Cale entered the wildlands, a delegation of high-ranking alphas arrived at the boundary, demanding to know why their supreme alpha had not returned from what should have been a simple inspection tour. When the boundary guards reported that Cale had crossed into the wildlands and not emerged, the delegation immediately assumed he had been killed, and they began organizing a massive military expedition to avenge him and eliminate whatever threat had managed to destroy someone as powerful as Cale. Cale only learned about this development when one of his personally loyal scouts managed to track him deep into the healing forest. Arriving battered and exhausted from fighting through the corruption that still dominated the outer regions of the wildlands, the scout collapsed at Cale's feet and gasped out a warning between ragged breaths. An army was gathering. Thousands of werewolves, including some of the most powerful alphas in the realm, and they would reach the wildlands within days. If Cale didn't return immediately to call off the attack, they would invade in force, and nothing in the healing forest would survive their assault. Iris felt ice settle in her stomach as the implications sank in. Everything she had built, all the life she had coaxed back into existence, would be destroyed by werewolves who saw healing as a threat and purification as an attack on their way of life. Worse, the corruption in the outer wildlands would fight back against the invading army, killing werewolves by the hundreds and creating a massacre that would be blamed on her existence. The cycle of fear and violence would continue, perhaps become even more entrenched, and any chance of eventual reconciliation would be lost in an ocean of blood and rage. Cale stood frozen, his expression cycling through shock, anger, and a cold calculation that Iris found slightly frightening to witness. He could return to his territory and call off the attack with a single command, his authority, sufficient to override any objections. But doing so would require explaining why he had stayed in the wildlands so long, what he had been doing there, and why he was suddenly advocating for the protection of a place that had been used as an execution ground for centuries. The questions would be intense and hostile, and Cale would have to choose between lying to his people or revealing truths they were not ready to hear. Iris made the decision for both of them, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her chest. She told Cale to return to his territory, to use whatever explanation would be most believable to call off the invasion, but to not reveal her existence or the extent of the healing in the wildlands. Let them think he had been conducting secret research, or that he had been injured and needed time to recover. Whatever narrative would preserve both his position and the fragile peace she had established in her forest. She could feel Cale's resistance to the idea of leaving. Her could see the conflict written plainly across his face, but she insisted with a firmness that surprised them both. The truth was that Iris needed more time, needed to expand the healing zone far enough that it could withstand scrutiny and demonstrate its value rather than appearing as a threat. She also needed Cale to be in a position of power when the eventual confrontation came, because without his authority and influence, any attempt to reform werewolf society would be crushed before it could begin. So she sent him away, back to the world of politics and dominance that she was only beginning to understand, and she watched him go with a hollow feeling in her chest that she refused to identify as heartbreak. Cale returned to his fortress, with a story carefully crafted to be both believable and vague enough to discourage detailed investigation. He claimed to have discovered evidence of an ancient magical working in the wildlands that required extended study, and that he had been conducting experiments to understand its nature and potential applications. The explanation was met with skepticism, but ultimately accepted, mostly because no one could imagine a reason why the Supreme Alpha would lie about such things, and the planned invasion was called off with barely 24 hours to spare. But the incident had consequences that neither Cale nor Iris had fully anticipated. The High Court, already paranoid about potential threats to werewolf supremacy, became intensely interested in what Cale had supposedly discovered in the wildlands. They demanded regular reports on his research, sent their own investigators to examine the boundary for any changes, and began pulling ancient archives related to the wildlands' creation and purpose. The increased scrutiny made it dangerous for Cale to return to the healing forest, and for months he had to content himself with monitoring the changes in magical currents that told him Iris was still alive and still working. In the healing forest, Iris pushed herself harder than ever before, expanding the purified zone at a rate that left her exhausted every night, but that also produced undeniable results. Within 6 months, she had reclaimed nearly a quarter of the wildlands, transforming death into life and creating an oasis of natural beauty that attracted animals from far beyond the corrupted boundaries. She also began training the healed wolves to act as guardians and scouts, teaching them to work together with a intelligence and coordination that came from their connection to her and to each other. The forest was becoming something new, something that had never existed before. A place where guardian magic and natural life worked in perfect harmony, where every creature contributed to the health of the whole, and where the boundaries between species blurred into collaborative existence. Iris knew that when werewolf civilization finally learned about what she had created, they would see it as either a paradise to be seized or a threat to be destroyed. She was determined to make the forest strong enough to resist the latter and valuable enough to encourage the former. A year after being exiled to the wildlands, Iris received an unexpected visitor. An elderly human woman crossed the boundary into the healing forest, guided by healed wolves who recognized her scent as safe and brought her to Iris's central clearing. The woman was Martha, the head of the cleaning staff from the Temple of the Yao. First shift, and her presence in the wildlands defied so many expectations that Iris simply stared at her in shock for several seconds before remembering to offer hospitality. Martha accepted water and food gratefully, her aged body clearly exhausted from the journey, but her eyes were sharp and knowing as she studied Iris's transformed appearance. When she finally spoke, her words hit like hammer blows. She told Iris that she had known her mother, had been one of the last remaining guardians in, hiding before the final purge, and that she had watched Iris grow up from a distance with the terrible knowledge that the girl would eventually face the same persecution that had destroyed their people. The theft at the temple, Martha explained, had not been theft at all, but rather the actions of corrupt priests who had discovered evidence that a guardian bloodline still survived in the capital. They had staged the crime specifically to have Iris arrested and eliminated, knowing that her emerging abilities would eventually pose a threat to their power. Martha had tried to protect Iris by warning her to forget what she had seen, but it had been too late by then, and all she had been able to do was watch helplessly as the girl was condemned to death. But Martha had not been idle in the years since. She had gathered the few remaining humans who remembered the old ways, who still carried fragments of guardian knowledge passed down through generations of careful hiding. She had brought them to the edge of the healing forest, dozens of people who were ready to learn, to help, to reclaim the heritage that had been stolen from them. They were tired of subjugation and ready to risk everything for a chance at something better. And they were offering themselves to Iris's cause, with the full knowledge that doing so might result in their execution if werewolf authorities discovered them. Iris stood in her clearing, surrounded by healed animals and ancient trees that whispered secrets in languages only she could hear, and felt the weight of leadership settling onto her shoulders like a mantle she had never sought but could not refuse. She was no longer just a survivor healing corruption in isolation. She was becoming the focal point of a movement, a symbol of resistance and hope for people who had been oppressed for so long they had almost forgotten what freedom tasted like. She accepted Martha's offer and welcomed the refugees into her forest, setting them to work, learning guardian techniques and helping to accelerate the healing process. She also sent a message to Kale through carefully established channels, letting him know that the situation had changed and that events were accelerating beyond their ability to control through caution and patience. The time for hiding and gradual preparation was ending. Soon, very soon, the werewolf world would have to confront the reality of what was growing in the heart of the wildlands, and how they responded would determine the fate of everyone involved. If this story has captivated you, please don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments about what you think will happen when the two worlds finally collide, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the explosive conclusion. The message reached Kale during a high court session, where he was being pressed once again to provide concrete results from his supposed research in the wildlands. He maintained his carefully neutral expression while reading the encoded letter, but internally his mind was racing through implications and scenarios. Iris was no longer alone, which meant the healing forest was no longer just an anomaly, but potentially the seed of an organized resistance movement. That changed everything, elevated the situation from a personal interest to a political crisis that would eventually demand his public response. He needed to buy more time, needed to create conditions where Iris and her people could demonstrate their value and their lack of hostile intent before paranoia and fear drove the High Court to order their extermination. But the court was already suspicious, already looking for threats to justify their continued dominance, and Kale's own position was becoming increasingly precarious as questions mounted about his loyalties and his extended interest in a place that should hold nothing but death. The solution, when it came to him, was risky enough to qualify as insane, but also elegant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to hide what Iris was accomplishing, he would reveal it himself, but frame it as a tremendous opportunity rather than a threat. At the next High Court session, Kale stood before the assembled alphas and made an announcement that sent shockwaves through the chamber. He claimed that his research had yielded a method for purifying corruption in the wildlands, that he had identified the key to reclaiming vast territories that had been lost for centuries, and that implementing this technique on a large scale could double the habitable land available to their growing population. The court reacted with predictable greed and interest, demanding to know the details of this purification method and why Kale had waited so long to share such valuable information. He told them a carefully edited version of the truth, that the technique required individuals with specific rare abilities, that he had located several such individuals among the human population, and that establishing the infrastructure for large-scale purification would require significant time and resources, but would ultimately prove invaluable to the realm. It was a gamble of enormous proportions, because Kale was essentially revealing Iris's existence and abilities, while betting that the promise of expanded territory would override the court's instinctive hostility toward guardian magic. If his gamble paid off, Iris and her people would gain official sanction to continue their work, and he could position himself as the architect of a new era of prosperity, built on collaboration rather than oppression. If his gamble failed, he would have painted a target on Iris's back and destroyed any chance of protecting her from the inevitable purge. The High Court debated for 3 days before reaching a decision, and those 3 days aged Kale more than entire decades had in his long life. He could not warn Iris about what was coming, could not prepare her for the inspection and evaluation that the court would inevitably demand before committing resources to his proposal. All he could do was trust that she was as strong and capable as she had proven herself to be, and hope that the healing forest had developed enough to demonstrate its value even to the most skeptical observers. When the court finally announced their decision, it was a compromise that satisfied no one but that everyone could accept as necessary. They would send a small delegation to examine Kale's claims, including several high-ranking alphas with expertise in magic and land management, and if the delegation verified that the purification technique was real and effective, the court would authorize the establishment of a formal reclamation project with Kyle as its director. The delegation would leave within a week, which gave Kyle barely enough time to send warning to Iris and pray that she could prepare for the most important performance of her life. The message reached Iris 3 days before the delegation was scheduled to arrive at the boundary, and she immediately understood the stakes involved. She gathered Martha and the other refugees, along with her council of healed wolves and the various creatures who had made the healing forest their home, and she explained the situation with brutal honesty. The werewolves were coming to judge whether their existence had value, and if the delegation reported favorably, they would gain protection and resources. If the delegation reported negatively, they would all be executed as threats to public safety, and everything they had built would be destroyed. Iris had 3 days to transform her forest from a refuge for the desperate into a showcase of guardian abilities that would convince powerful werewolves to abandon centuries of prejudice. It should have been impossible, but Iris had stopped believing in impossible when she healed her first corrupted wolf, and she threw herself into the challenge with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. She organized the refugees into teams, each responsible for a different aspect of preparing for the delegation's arrival. Some focused on accelerating the healing of the most visibly corrupted areas near the boundary, creating a stark demonstration of before and after that would be undeniable. Others worked on creating beautiful and functional structures, using living plants woven together with guardian magic, buildings that grew rather than being constructed, and that demonstrated capabilities no werewolf architect could match. Still others prepared presentations of the medicinal plants and useful materials that could be harvested from a healed wildlands, emphasizing the economic value of their work. Iris herself focused on the most dramatic demonstration she could conceive, healing a massive ancient tree that stood at the very heart of the original corruption, a twisted monstrosity that had once been the most sacred tree in the Guardian Groves, before dark magic had transformed it into a symbol of everything lost. The tree was over 1,000 years old, and so thoroughly corrupted that even Iris had avoided it before, knowing that attempting to heal it would require more power than she had ever channeled at once. But if she could succeed, if she could restore that ancient symbol to its former glory, the message would be unmistakable. Guardian magic could reclaim anything, heal any wound, restore what had been thought permanently lost. She began the healing at dawn on the day before the delegation's arrival, settling into a meditative state and sinking her awareness into the tree's corrupted roots. What she found there was worse than she had imagined. Layer upon layer of dark magic wound through the tree's structure like parasitic vines, choking out life and replacing it with malevolent energy that fought back against her attempts to purify it. The battle of wills took place entirely in the magical realm, invisible to Observers, but absolutely exhausting for Iris, as she poured everything she had into unraveling centuries of corruption. Hours passed, then a full day, and Iris remained locked in her struggle with the tree, her body glowing with green and gold light, as power flowed through her in volumes that should have killed a normal human. The refugees kept watch around her, protecting her vulnerable form from any threats, while Martha monitored her vital signs and prayed to deities who had been forgotten for centuries that the girl would survive her own ambition. When Iris finally succeeded, the transformation was so dramatic that it could be seen for miles. The twisted black trunk straightened and healed, corrupted bark falling away to reveal healthy wood underneath that gleamed like polished bronze. The canopy exploded with new growth, branches reaching toward the sky and unfurling leaves that shimmered with colors that existed nowhere else in nature. Flowers bloomed across the tree's surface, filling the air with a fragrance that spoke of renewal and hope, and the ground around its roots erupted with spring growth that spread outward in waves like ripples on a pond. Iris collapsed the moment the healing was complete, her body finally reaching the limits of what it could endure, but she had accomplished something that would be remembered for generations. The ancient tree stood as living proof that guardian magic could achieve what werewolf power never could, that some things required collaboration with nature rather than dominance over it, and that the old ways held value that should never have been discarded. When the delegation arrived at the boundary the next morning, they were greeted by a sight that defied all their expectations. Instead of the corrupted wasteland they had been prepared to traverse carefully, they found a healthy forest that welcomed them with gentle breezes and bird song. Healed animals watched them from the undergrowth without fear or hostility, and the path to Iris's central clearing was lined with flowering plants that filled the air with beauty. The delegation was led by Elder Thorn, the same alpha who had presided over Iris's trial a year before, and his expression as he took in the transformation was a complex mixture of shock, suspicion, and something that might have been grudging respect. Cale had accompanied the delegation, despite attempts by some court members to exclude him, using his authority as Supreme Alpha to override their objections, and his relief at seeing Iris alive and the forest thriving was palpable even through his careful political mask. When they reached the central clearing, they found Iris waiting for them beneath the newly healed ancient tree, her appearance so transformed from the frightened girl who had been dragged before the court that several delegates initially failed to recognize her. She stood tall and proud, her green-streaked hair braided with living flowers, and her eyes glowing with calm confidence as she welcomed them to her domain. Elder Thorn began to speak, his tone condescending as he prepared to question her about the techniques used and the sustainability of the healing. But Iris cut him off with a gesture that was both polite and utterly commanding. She told him that she would demonstrate what guardian magic could accomplish, show them the full potential of collaboration between their people, but that in return, she required his honest assessment, free from the prejudices that had sent her here to die. If he could not provide that honesty, then the demonstration would be pointless, and he should leave immediately. The challenge hung in the air between them, and Cale held his breath while waiting to see how Thorn would respond. The Elder Alpha could choose to be offended, could assert his dominance and refuse to be dictated to by a human regardless of her abilities, but he could also choose to accept the challenge, to prove that he was capable of setting aside his assumptions long enough to evaluate the evidence before him. The decision Thorn made in that moment would determine the trajectory of everything that followed, and both Iris and Cale knew it. After a long pause, Elder Thorn inclined his head in the barest suggestion of a nod, acknowledging Iris's terms. He told her that he would observe with an open mind, that he would judge the evidence fairly, and that his report to the High Court would reflect what he truly witnessed, rather than what he expected to see. It was not quite an apology for the injustice of her trial, but it was more than Iris had dared hope for, and she accepted it with grace that made even Thorn's hardened expression soften slightly. What followed was a demonstration of guardian abilities that left the delegation speechless, with wonder and disbelief. Iris showed them how corruption could be purified at its source, how damaged ecosystems could be restored to balance, how plants could be encouraged to produce medicines and materials with properties far superior to anything available in werewolf territories. She introduced them to the refugees who had learned guardian techniques, proving that the abilities could be taught and spread rather than being limited to a rare few. She showed them structures built from living wood that were stronger and more beautiful than stone construction, gardens that produced food year-round without depleting the soil, and water purification systems that worked through collaboration with natural processes rather than magical brute force. By the time evening fell, and Iris finally paused her presentation, even the most skeptical members of the delegation were forced to admit that what they had witnessed was real and valuable. The healing forest represented capabilities that could transform werewolf civilization if properly utilized, could solve resource problems that had plagued them for generations, and could open up territories that had been written off as permanently lost. The question was no longer whether guardian abilities had value, but rather how to integrate them into werewolf society, without fundamentally challenging the power structures that had existed for centuries. That night, around a fire built from fallen branches that burned with fragrant smoke, the delegation and Iris's people shared a meal and began the difficult conversations about what the future might look like. Elder Thorn asked the question that everyone was thinking, but few had the courage to voice. If guardian magic was so powerful and valuable, why had werewolves worked so hard to destroy those who possessed it? And could they really expect forgiveness for that genocide now that they needed guardian help? Iris's answer was simple and devastating in its clarity. She told them that the past could not be changed, and that dwelling on old grievances would accomplish nothing except perpetuating cycles of violence and revenge. But the future could be shaped by choices made in the present, and she was willing to work toward reconciliation if werewolves were willing to acknowledge their mistakes and commit to genuine equality, rather than simply finding new ways to exploit those they had previously oppressed. She would not accept being used as a tool for werewolf prosperity while humans continued to be treated as inferior, would not lend her abilities to maintaining the same unjust system that had condemned her to death. The terms were clear, and they were non-negotiable. If werewolves wanted access to guardian magic and the benefits it could provide, they would have to reform their entire civilization, dismantle the hierarchies of dominance and submission, and build something new based on collaboration and mutual respect. It was a demand that should have been met with outrage and refusal, a complete overturning of everything werewolf society was built upon. But Cale, who had spent the past year preparing for exactly this moment, stepped forward and added his voice to Iris's proposal. He told the delegation that he supported complete and comprehensive reform, that he believed werewolf civilization had reached a turning point where they could either evolve or stagnate, and that he was willing to use his authority as Supreme Alpha to push for the changes Iris demanded. He acknowledged that the transition would be difficult, and that there would be resistance from those who benefited from the current system. But he argued that the alternative was watching their civilization slowly rot from within, as injustice and oppression poisoned everything they claimed to value. The delegation departed the next morning with much to consider and report to the High Court, their minds reeling from the implications of what they had witnessed and the choices they would soon have to make. Elder Thorn took Iris aside before leaving and spoke to her with a sincerity that seemed to cost him considerable effort. He told her that her trial had been unjust, that the evidence against her had been fabricated by priests he now suspected of far darker crimes, and that if he could undo that injustice, he would. It was not an adequate apology for the trauma and suffering she had endured, but it was a start, and Iris accepted it with the same grace she had shown throughout the delegation's visit. In the weeks that followed, the healing forest became the center of intense political maneuvering as the High Court debated how to respond to the delegation's report. Some alphas argued for immediate military action to seize control of the wildlands and force Iris and her people into servitude. Others advocated for more measured approaches that would allow them to benefit from guardian magic while minimizing the social upheaval that full equality would entail. And a growing faction, led by Cale and supported by Elder Thorn's surprisingly positive report, pushed for accepting Iris's terms and beginning the long process of genuine reform. The debate raged for months, with public opinion swaying back and forth as different factions leaked information designed to support their positions. Humans throughout werewolf territories heard rumors of the healing forest and the possibility of liberation, sparking hopes that had been dormant for generations. Younger werewolves who had grown up questioning the necessity of oppression found their voices amplified by the controversy, while older alphas clung to traditional values and argued that any change would destroy everything their ancestors had built. Through it all, Iris continued her work in the healing forest, expanding the purified zone and training more refugees in guardian techniques. She refused to be drawn into the political battles being fought in her name, trusting Kale to navigate those treacherous waters, while she focused on creating something so valuable and so beautiful that even the most resistant werewolves would hesitate to destroy it. The resolution, when it finally came, was neither the complete victory Iris had hoped for, nor the crushing defeat her enemies had intended. The High Court issued a decree establishing the Wildlands Reclamation Project as an official initiative under Kale's direction, granting Iris and her people protection from persecution as long as they remained within designated territories and submitted to periodic inspections. In exchange, guardian techniques would be taught to selected werewolves and implemented throughout the realm to address environmental and resource challenges. It was a compromise that left everyone unsatisfied, but that represented real progress toward the future Iris envisioned. Humans involved in the project would be granted freedoms and protections unprecedented in werewolf society, serving as a proof of concept for broader reforms. Kale would have the authority to gradually reshape his territory according to new principles, demonstrating that equality could coexist with prosperity. And Iris would have the space and resources to complete her healing work while building the foundation for lasting change. The relationship between Iris and Kale continued to deepen throughout this tumultuous period, evolving from wary allies to genuine partners who could read each other's thoughts with a glance. They never formally acknowledged the bond forming between them, never named the emotions that made Kale's chest ache when he had to leave the healing forest, or that made Iris's heart race when she heard he was returning. There were too many complications, too many eyes watching for any sign of inappropriate attachment between the Supreme Alpha and the Guardian, who had somehow become the most important person in his long life. But everyone who saw them together recognized what they refused to admit, could see the way they orbited each other like binary stars caught in each other's gravity. Their connection transcended physical attraction or political alliance, representing instead a bridge between two different ways of being in the world. A promise that cooperation could be more powerful than domination if people were brave enough to try. 5 years after Iris had been thrown into the wildlands to die, she stood once again at the boundary between corruption and health. But this time the boundary had shifted dramatically. Nearly 3/4 of the wildlands had been reclaimed, transformed from nightmare landscape into thriving forest that attracted visitors from across the werewolf realm. Guardian techniques had been integrated into resource management throughout Kyle's territory and were slowly spreading to other regions as their value became undeniable. Humans who worked on reclamation projects were paid fair wages and treated with respect, serving as living proof that the old hierarchies were neither natural nor necessary. The change was slower and more incremental than Iris had once dreamed, full of setbacks and compromises that sometimes felt like betrayals of her principles. But it was real change, measurable and sustainable, and it gave her hope that the world her eventual children would inherit might be fundamentally different from the one she had been born into. The wounds of the past could not be healed overnight, any more than the corruption of the wildlands could be purified in a single gesture. But patient work over time could accomplish transformations that seemed impossible when first contemplated. Kale arrived at the forest as the sun was setting, his visits now regular enough that the healed wolves no longer announced his presence with alarm. He found Iris at her usual evening post beneath the ancient tree, her hands pressed against its trunk as she communed with the network of life that spread beneath the forest floor. When she opened her eyes and smiled at him, Kale felt the same jolt of recognition he had experienced the first time he saw her, the sense that she represented everything he had been missing in his long life without knowing what he lacked. He had been planning to wait, to continue the careful dance of not acknowledging what existed between them, until the political situation stabilized further. But standing there in the golden light of sunset, watching Iris glow with the residual magic of her communion with the forest. Cale found he was tired of waiting and planning and always putting duty ahead of desire. So he closed the distance between them and spoke the words he had been holding back. For years, telling her that he loved her, that she had transformed not just the wildlands, but his entire understanding of what life could be, and that if she would have him, he wanted to spend whatever time remained to him working at her side to build the world they both believed in. Iris's eyes widened with surprise and something that looked like joy, and she responded by pulling him down into a kiss that tasted of spring rain and wild honey. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and grinning like fools, she told him that she had loved him almost from the moment he had knelt in her clearing and chosen to learn rather than conquer, and that she could imagine no better partner for the work that still lay ahead. Their bond would be complicated, would draw criticism from those who thought a supreme alpha should choose a mate from among powerful werewolf families rather than a human guardian. But they had both survived too much and fought too hard for the right to live, authentically to care what narrow-minded people thought about their choices. That night, as they lay together beneath the stars with the healed forest breathing peacefully around them, Iris and Cale made plans for the future that went far beyond political reform or environmental restoration. They talked about building a new kind of pack that would welcome humans, werewolves, and anyone else who wanted to be part of something better. They imagined a world where children of all species grew up, learning both werewolf strength and guardian collaboration, where power was measured by what you protected rather than what you dominated. They dreamed of expanding the healing far beyond the wildlands, reclaiming all the damaged places in the world, and proving that nothing was beyond redemption if people were willing to put in the work. And though they both knew that achieving those dreams would require decades of effort, and that they would face opposition and setbacks along the way, they also knew that they had already accomplished things that everyone said were impossible. They had transformed death into life, enemies into allies, and a place of exile into a beacon of hope that drew people from across the realm who were tired of cruelty and ready for something better. If they could do that, they could do anything, as long as they faced the future together with patience, determination, and the absolute conviction that love and healing were stronger than fear and domination. The girl, who had been thrown into the wildlands as punishment, had not just survived, but had thrived, had taken the death sentence meant to silence her and transformed it into a declaration that echoed across the world, that the supposedly weak could become powerful, that the oppressed could become free, and that systems built on injustice would eventually crumble when confronted by people brave enough to imagine something better and stubborn enough to make it real.